Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Grace Carter. Grace Carter had only $18 left in the world. Not 1800, not 80.18, a wrinkled 10, a faded 5, and 3 single bills folded inside the small pocket of her black housekeeping uniform. That money was supposed to carry her through the next 2 days: bus fare to the Moretti mansion, a loaf of bread, maybe a small carton of milk for her mother if the corner store still had discounts near closing. But at 11:47 that night, under the flickering yellow light outside Bellamy's pharmacy, Grace saw a man sitting on the cold pavement with one hand pressed to his chest. He was old, maybe 70, maybe more. His gray coat was too thin for the wind, and his breathing came in short, uneven pulls. People walked around him like water moving around a stone. A young couple glanced down, then looked away. A man in a business suit stepped over his outstretched hand without slowing. Grace stopped. She had spent the whole day polishing floors inside a mansion where the chandeliers cost more than her entire neighborhood block. Her back ached. Her fingers smelled of lemon soap and bleach. Her shoes had a split near the heel, and every step let in the winter air. Still, she stopped. "Sir," she asked softly, "are you all right?" The man lifted his face. His eyes were pale, watery, frightened. "My wallet," he whispered. "Someone took my wallet. I need my medicine. They won't give it without payment." Grace looked through the pharmacy window. Behind the glass, the cashier was already shaking his head, arms crossed, impatient. "How much?" Grace asked. The old man swallowed. $18. The number landed between them like a test. Grace's hand went to her pocket. That was everything. Her bus ride, her dinner, her mother's milk, her tiny shield against another humiliating day. For a moment, she saw the Moretti mansion in her mind. Marble floors, velvet curtains, silver trays, men in black suits who never smiled. She thought of Dante Moretti, the man everyone in the city whispered about. A man who could move money, weapons, and people with one phone call. A man powerful enough to make the world bend. And here she was, standing outside a pharmacy, deciding whether to give away the last $18 she owned. The old man looked away, ashamed. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Forget I asked." Grace closed her eyes for one breath. Then she pulled out the bills. The cashier barely looked at her when she placed the money on the counter. He counted it slowly, suspiciously, as if poverty itself might be counterfeit. Grace said nothing. She only waited until the small white paper bag slid toward her. Outside, she placed it in the old man's trembling hands. He stared at it, then at her. "Why would you help a stranger?" he asked, voice breaking. "When you have almost nothing?" Grace gave him a tired smile. "Because nobody should be left alone when they're scared." The old man held the medicine to his chest. And across the street, behind the tinted window of a parked black sedan, someone lowered a phone camera. Grace did not see it. She only turned her collar against the wind and began the long walk home. By morning, 5 black SUVs would be parked outside her little house, and the entire street would go silent. By the time Grace Carter reached her street, the soles of her shoes were wet from the thin layer of ice melting along the sidewalk. Her house stood at the end of a narrow block where the streetlights blinked like tired eyes. It was not really a house, not in the way people in the Moretti world understood houses. It was a 2-room rental with peeling blue paint, a crooked porch, and windows sealed with plastic to keep the cold from slipping through. Inside, her mother was asleep on the couch beneath 2 blankets. Grace entered quietly, closing the door with her hip so the hinges would not groan. The living room smelled faintly of menthol cream, old wood, and the vegetable soup she had stretched across 3 dinners. On the small table beside her mother sat a row of prescription bottles, each one a reminder that survival came with receipts. "Grace?" her mother whispered without opening her eyes. "I'm home, Mama." "You eat." Grace paused. Then she smiled softly, even though no one could see it in the dark. "Yes, ma'am." It was a gentle lie. The kind poor daughters told sick mothers so they could sleep without guilt. She slipped into the kitchen, opened the cupboard, and found 1 sleeve of crackers. 3 left. She ate one slowly, letting it soften on her tongue, then wrapped the other 2 back for morning. Tomorrow would be hard. No bus fare. No breakfast. No way to arrive at the Moretti mansion on time unless she left before sunrise and walked nearly 5 miles across the city. But when Grace lay down on the thin mattress beside the radiator, she did not regret giving away the money. She saw the old man's hands trembling around that medicine bag. She heard the fear in his voice. And in the darkness, Grace whispered to herself, "Lord, let him be okay." She had no idea that the old man's name was Elias Romano. She had no idea that, 27 years earlier, Elias had pulled a bleeding young man named Lorenzo Moretti out of a burning car and kept him alive long enough for help to arrive. And she had no idea that Lorenzo's son, Dante Moretti, owed Elias a debt that money had never been able to repay. At 4:52 the next morning, Grace rose before the alarm. Her legs ached from the night before. Her stomach cramped with hunger. Still, she washed her face in cold water, pinned her hair back, and pressed her black uniform between two towels so it would look less wrinkled. Then she kissed her mother's forehead and stepped into the gray morning. The walk to the mansion felt endless. Buses hissed past her, warm windows glowing with people who had coins, cards, somewhere to sit. Grace kept her eyes forward. The city woke around her in layers, delivery trucks reversing, bakery doors opening, men in suits checking watches, women hurrying through steam rising from the subway grates. By the time she reached the iron gates of the Moretti estate, her feet were numb. The mansion rose above the hill like a palace built to intimidate heaven itself. White stone columns, black glass windows, a fountain frozen at the edges. Security cameras turned silently as Grace passed through the servants' entrance. She was 12 minutes late. That was all it took. Mrs. Valentina, the head housekeeper, was waiting in the corridor with her arms folded. Her silver hair was pulled into a perfect knot, and her mouth held the thin satisfaction of someone who enjoyed catching weakness. "Miss Carter," she said sharply. Grace stopped. "Good morning, Mrs. Valentina. Is it?" Two maids polishing the hallway mirror slowed down. A young kitchen assistant looked up from carrying a tray. Grace kept her hands folded in front of her. "I'm sorry. I had trouble getting here." Mrs. Valentina's eyes dropped to Grace's shoes, cracked at the heel, damp from the streets. "Trouble," she repeated. "This is a private estate, not a charity shelter. Mr. Moretti pays for discipline, not excuses." Grace swallowed. "I understand." "No, I don't think you do." Valentina stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound cruel rather than loud. "If you can't afford transportation, perhaps you shouldn't work in a home where even the floors are worth more than your entire life." The hallway went still. One of the maids looked away. Someone in the kitchen gave a nervous laugh, then covered it with a cough. Grace felt the words hit her harder than the cold had. But she did not cry. She only lowered her eyes and said, "It won't happen again." From the upper landing, behind the carved oak railing, Dante Moretti had stopped walking. He had come down for an early meeting, dressed in a black suit, cufflinks gleaming, his face unreadable in the chandelier light. Two men stood behind him, silent as shadows. Dante had heard every word. His gaze moved from Valentina's smug face to Grace's wet shoes, then to the way Grace held herself, bruised by humiliation, but not broken by it. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his phone vibrated. A message appeared on the screen from a private clinic downtown. Elias Romano regained consciousness. "He's asking for you." Dante's eyes narrowed. And somewhere deep in the mansion, the air began to change. Dante Moretti did not hurry. Men like him never had to. He descended the staircase slowly, one hand brushing the polished oak railing, his black shoes silent against the runner. Carpet. The staff felt him before they fully saw him. Conversations died. Silver trays stopped moving. Even Mrs. Valentina straightened, as if her spine had suddenly remembered fear. Grace kept her eyes down. She had learned, in 7 months inside that mansion, that Dante Moretti's silence was louder than most men's shouting. "Mrs. Valentina," he said. The head housekeeper turned, her face instantly changing from cruelty to polished respect. "Mr. Moretti, good morning." Dante's gaze did not move from her. "Is it?" The same words she had used on Grace came back colder now, stripped of all her confidence. Valentina blinked. "Sir." Dante stepped onto the marble floor. The chandelier light cut sharp lines across his face. He looked at Grace's wet shoes again, then at the other staff members pretending not to listen. "Miss Carter was late," Valentina said quickly. "I was simply correcting." "Humiliating," Dante interrupted. The word landed softly. That made it worse. Mrs. Valentina's mouth opened. then closed. Grace finally looked up, just for a second, long enough to see that Dante was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at the room as if something rotten had revealed itself under expensive paint. "There is a difference," he said, "between discipline and cruelty." No one breathed. Valentina's fingers tightened around the clipboard in her hands. "Of course, sir. I only meant that standards must be maintained." Dante tilted his head slightly. "Standards?" He let the word hang there. Then he turned to Grace. "Miss Carter, my office. 10 minutes." Grace's stomach dropped. "Yes, sir." She did not know whether she was being fired, questioned, or punished for arriving late. In the Moretti mansion, invitations to private offices rarely meant comfort. Dante walked away without another word. The moment he disappeared down the corridor, the hallway exhaled. Mrs. Valentina's face had gone pale beneath her makeup, but her eyes cut toward Grace with fresh resentment. "You heard him," she said tightly. "Do not keep him waiting." Grace nodded and moved toward the staff washroom, where she changed her soaked socks and tried to clean the mud from the edges of her shoes with a damp paper towel. Her hands trembled, not from fear alone, from hunger, from exhaustion, from the strange ache of being defended by a man who had never once spoken more than 3 words to her. 10 minutes later, Grace stood outside Dante Moretti's office. The door was dark walnut, carved with old Italian patterns. Behind it came the low murmur of men's voices, then silence. One of Dante's bodyguards opened the door and stepped aside. "Go in." Grace entered. The office smelled of leather, coffee, and winter rain. Books lined one wall. A black marble fireplace burned without making the room warm. Dante stood behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his jaw tight. "I'm coming," he said into the phone. "Keep him comfortable. No visitors until I arrive." He ended the call. For a moment, he said nothing. Grace stood with her hands folded, feeling small against the massive desk, the tall windows, the quiet power of everything around her. "You walked here," Dante said. It was not a question. Grace swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Why?" She looked down. "I missed the bus." "You didn't miss the bus." His voice stayed calm. "You couldn't pay for it." Grace's head lifted. Dante opened a folder on his desk and turned it toward her. Inside was a still image from a security camera outside Bellamy's pharmacy. Grainy, dark, but clear enough. Grace standing under the yellow light. Grace handing $18 to an old man. Her breath caught. Dante watched her carefully. "You gave your last money to Elias Romano." Grace's brow furrowed. "I didn't know his name." "I know. Is he all right?" That was her first question. Not, "Am I in trouble?" Not, "How did you get that picture?" Not, "Why are you watching me?" Only, "Is he all right?" Something moved behind Dante's eyes, something quiet and unexpected. "He's alive," Dante said. "Because he got his medicine in time." Grace closed her eyes, relief passing over her face like sunlight through rain. "Thank God," she whispered. Dante studied her as if he were seeing her for the first time. Then he asked, very softly, "Why didn't you tell Mrs. Valentina the truth?" Grace looked at the floor again. "Because kindness shouldn't be used as a defense." "Sir." The fire cracked once in the fireplace. Dante went still. For years, men had begged in this office, lied in this office, sold each other out beneath the weight of his stare. But this woman, hungry and humiliated, had just said something no one in his world would have understood. Kindness without witness. Sacrifice without applause. Dante closed the folder. "Go back to work, Miss Carter." Grace nodded, confused. "Yes, sir." She reached the door before his voice stopped her. "And Grace." She turned. Dante's expression was unreadable. "Do not make any plans after your shift." The room went quiet. Grace did not know it yet, but by sunset, Dante Moretti would uncover every debt, every threat, every cruel hand pressing down on her life. And the next morning, 5 black SUVs would roll toward her street like judgment dressed in chrome. Grace spent the rest of the morning cleaning the east wing with a question sitting heavy in her chest. "Do not make any plans after your shift." The words followed her through every room. They followed the sweep of her cloth across polished tables, the quiet clink of crystal glasses, the soft drag of the vacuum over rugs imported from places she would never see. Every time one of Dante's men passed the doorway, Grace felt her shoulders tighten. She did not know whether Dante meant to help her or punish her. In houses like this, Kindness from powerful men could be more frightening than anger. Anger was simple. Anger had a shape. But quiet attention? That was dangerous. By noon, Mrs. Valentina made sure Grace understood her place. She assigned her the back staircase, then the servants' pantry, then the guest bathrooms already cleaned by someone else. Every task came with a clipped instruction. Every correction was just loud enough for other staff to hear. You missed a spot. Grace looked down at the spotless marble. Yes, ma'am. And your uniform looks tired. Yes, ma'am. And when Mr. Moretti calls you into his office again, remember that pity is not promotion. Grace's hand paused around the cleaning cloth. For 1 second, the room seemed to shrink. Then Grace lowered her eyes. Yes, ma'am. Valentina smiled, satisfied. She did not know that upstairs, behind a closed office door, Dante Moretti was no longer thinking about the mansion. He was thinking about a woman who had given away her last $18 and then walked 5 miles to work without mentioning it to anyone. On his desk lay 3 folders. The first held Grace Carter's employment file. 7 months of perfect attendance until that morning, no complaints, no sick days, no requests for advance pay. The second held her rental records, late notices, illegal fees, threats written in red ink by a landlord named Harold Pike. The third held medical bills under her mother's name, folded and refolded so many times the paper had started to tear at the creases. Dante stared at them for a long time. His world was built on debts. Men owed him money, favors, silence, loyalty. But this was different. Grace owed the world nothing, and still she gave. His phone rang. Dante answered without looking away from the folders. Speak. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Bell, the physician at the private clinic. Mr. Romano is asking for you again. I'm on my way. There's something else, the doctor said. He keeps asking about the woman from the pharmacy. He said she saved his life. Dante's jaw tightened. He's right. 30 minutes later, Dante stood beside Elias Romano's hospital bed. The old man looked smaller than Dante remembered. Time had carved deep lines into his face, but his eyes were still sharp beneath the weakness. A monitor beeped steadily beside him. You look terrible, Elias whispered. Dante almost smiled. You look worse. Elias gave a breathless laugh, then winced. She didn't know me, he said. I know. She thought I was just some old man on the sidewalk. Dante's eyes moved to the paper medicine bag on the bedside table. She gave you everything she had. Elias turned his head slowly. No, Dante. She gave me more than money. The room quieted. Outside the window, the city moved in gray winter light, careless and loud. She gave me dignity, Elias said. Do you understand how rare that is? To be weak in public and not be treated like garbage. Dante said nothing, but his face changed. Not much, just enough. The kind of change only men who had known him for decades would notice. Elias reached for his hand with trembling fingers. Find out who has been stepping on that woman's life. Dante looked down at him. I already have. When Dante returned to the mansion near sunset, Grace was in the laundry room folding white linen napkins beneath fluorescent light. Her feet throbbed. Her stomach had gone past hunger into something hollow and quiet. The door opened. Dante stood there. Behind him waited 2 men in black suits. Grace rose quickly. Sir. Dante held out her coat. Come with me. Her heart stumbled. Did I do something wrong? For the first time that day, Dante's voice softened. No, Grace. He looked at the tired coat in his hand, then back at her. Someone else did. The laundry room went silent. Top of form, bottom of form. Grace followed Dante Moretti out of the laundry room with her coat held tightly against her chest. The hallway seemed longer than usual. Staff members looked up as she passed. Some pretended not to stare. Others failed. Mrs. Valentina stood near the silver cabinet with a stack of inventory sheets in her hands, her face tightening when she saw Grace walking beside the master of the house. Not behind him, beside him. Dante did not slow down. Outside, the winter evening had turned the estate blue. A black car waited at the foot of the steps, engine running, headlights cutting through the mist. One of Dante's men opened the rear door. Grace stopped. Mr. Moretti, she said carefully, where are we going? Dante looked at her. To see the man you saved. Her breath caught. The old man. Elias Romano. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Dante said it carried history. Wait. Dead. Grace climbed into the car. The leather seat was warm beneath her, softer than anything in her own home. She sat stiffly, knees together, hands folded over her worn coat, afraid to touch too much. Dante sat beside her, not close, but close enough that she could feel the gravity of him. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The city passed outside the tinted windows, corner stores, bus stops, people carrying groceries, children in puffy jackets walking home from school. Grace watched it all like someone staring at a life she understood, while trapped inside a car from a world she did not. Finally, Dante said, "You asked if he was all right before you asked why I had that photograph." Grace lowered her eyes. He looked scared last night. Most people would have walked past him. Most people did. Dante turned slightly toward her. And that did not make you angry? Grace thought about it. The cashier's cold face. The strangers stepping around Elias. The wind moving through the old man's thin coat. It made me sad, she said. Anger takes energy, sir. Some days, I have to save mine for surviving. Dante looked away. Something in that answer reached a place in him no threat had ever touched. The clinic stood behind iron gates on a quiet street lined with bare trees. It did not smell like the hospitals Grace knew. No crowded waiting room. No shouting. No old coffee. Only polished floors, white orchids, soft light, and money disguised as peace. A nurse led them to a private room. Elias Romano lay propped against pillows, a blanket over his knees. He looked better than he had outside the pharmacy, though his face was still pale. When he saw Grace, his eyes filled instantly. "There she is," he whispered. Grace stopped at the door. Dante stepped aside, giving her room. Elias reached out a trembling hand. "Come here, child." Grace approached slowly. "I'm glad you're okay," she said. Elias laughed softly, but the sound broke near the end. "Because of you. I only bought medicine." No, his fingers closed gently around hers. "You saw me." Grace's lips pressed together. For a moment, she was no longer in a private clinic with a mafia boss standing behind her. She was just a tired woman being thanked for something she had never expected anyone to notice. Elias looked past her to Dante. "You found out." Dante's voice was quiet. "Enough." Grace turned. "Found out what?" Dante did not answer at first. Then he reached inside his coat and removed a folded paper. Grace recognized it immediately. A red eviction notice. Her face went cold. "How did you get that?" "Your landlord taped a copy to your door this afternoon," Dante said. "My people saw it." Grace's hand tightened around the paper. "I was going to handle it." Dante's eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. "With what, Grace?" The question was not cruel. That made it hurt more. She looked down, and shame rose hot behind her eyes. Not because she had done wrong, but because poverty always felt like a crime when someone rich finally saw it clearly. Elias squeezed her hand. "Do not lower your head for needing help," he said. "Lower it only if you stop helping others." The room fell silent. Dante watched Grace struggle to hold herself together. He saw the hunger she had hidden, the exhaustion she had folded neatly beneath obedience, the dignity that had survived every insult. When they left the clinic, night had settled over the city. At the car, Grace turned to Dante. "Please don't punish my landlord because of me." Dante looked toward the street, his face unreadable. "I'm not punishing him because of you." He opened the car door. "I'm answering what he did." Grace did not understand the difference yet. But the next morning, when the first black SUV turned onto her street, every curtain in the neighborhood would move. The next morning began with a sound Grace Carter had never heard on her street before. Engines. Not one. 5. Deep, expensive engines rolled through the narrow block just after sunrise, their low rumble making loose windows tremble in their frames. Curtains shifted. Porch doors cracked open. A dog barked once, then went quiet as if even it understood something unusual had arrived. Grace was in the kitchen, buttoning the cuff of her uniform, when her mother called from the couch. "Baby, why are there black cars outside?" Grace froze. The cup in her hand slipped slightly, water spilling across the counter. She moved to the window. 5 black SUVs lined the curb in front of their little blue rental house. Their windows were dark. Their paint shone like wet ink beneath the pale morning light. Men in black suits stepped out one by one, calm, silent, disciplined. Then the rear door of the middle SUV opened. Dante Moretti stepped onto the cracked sidewalk. The whole street seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Alvarez from next. Door clutched, her robe closed. 2 teenagers on bicycles stopped at the corner. Across the street, Harold Pike, Grace's landlord, came out of his duplex with a coffee mug in his hand and annoyance already forming on his face. Grace's heart pounded. "Oh Lord," her mother whispered behind her. "Grace, what happened?" "I don't know," Grace said. But that was not true. Some part of her knew. The kind part. The frightened part. The part that had learned long ago that when powerful people came to poor neighborhoods, they rarely came empty-handed. And they rarely came without consequence. A knock sounded at the door. Not loud. Just 3 calm taps. Grace opened it with trembling fingers. Dante stood on her porch, dressed in a charcoal overcoat, his expression unreadable. Behind him, one of his men held a leather folder. Another carried a small white envelope. "Good morning, Grace," Dante said. She swallowed. "Mr. Moretti." His eyes moved past her, briefly taking in the room. The thin blankets over her mother, the medicine bottles on the table, the cracked wall near the heater, the careful cleanliness that poverty had not been able to steal. Then he looked back at her. "May I come in?" Grace stepped aside. The house seemed too small for him, too fragile. Dante Moretti, who belonged among marble floors and guarded gates, stood in her tiny living room with his hands folded in front of him like a guest at church. Her mother struggled to sit up. "Ma'am," Dante said gently, before she could speak. "Please don't get up." Grace stared at him. She had heard men beg Dante Moretti. She had seen hardened bodyguards lower their eyes around him. She had watched powerful guests measure every word in his presence. But here, in front of her sick mother, his voice carried something else. Respect. Harold Pike's voice cut through the open doorway. "What is this?" he snapped from the porch. "Grace, you behind on rent, and now you bringing trouble to my property?" Grace flinched. Dante turned slowly. The room changed. Not with noise. Not with anger. With stillness. Harold Pike stopped at the threshold when he saw Dante's face. "You must be Mr. Pike," Dante said. Harold looked at the SUVs. Then at the men standing beside them. His confidence thinned. "Who's asking?" Dante's man opened the leather folder and handed him a stack of papers. Dante did not raise his voice. "You charged illegal late fees. You withheld repair requests for heat. You threatened eviction without proper notice. And yesterday, you taped a notice to this woman's door while her mother was inside sick." Harold's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Neighbors were watching now. Every porch. Every curtain. Every window. Dante stepped closer, but only enough for Harold to understand the weight of the moment. "You saw a woman with no protection," Dante said, "and decided that meant she had no value." Harold's coffee mug shook in his hand. I run a business." "No," Dante said. "You ran a trap." The words landed across the porch like thunder without sound. Grace stood behind him, one hand pressed to her chest, unable to move. One of Dante's men handed Harold another document. "You will return every illegal fee you took from Miss Carter," Dante continued. "You will cover the cost of temporary housing. You will cooperate with the attorney who is already reviewing every tenant complaint against you." Harold's face drained. "You can't just—" Dante looked at him. Harold stopped mid-word. The street went silent. Then Dante turned back to Grace and held out the white envelope. Inside was a single crisp $18 bill. Grace looked at it, confused. Dante's voice softened. "Elias asked me to return what you gave him." Grace shook her head. "I didn't give it to get it back." "I know," Dante said. And for the first time, something almost like warmth crossed his face. "That's why this isn't repayment." Behind him, the 5 SUVs waited like judgment. But in Grace Carter's small living room, beside a sick mother and a table full of medicine bottles, it felt like something else had arrived. Not charity. Not pity. Protection. Grace stared at the $18 bill as if it weighed more than gold. It sat in her palm, crisp and clean, untouched by rain, hunger, or fear. The same amount she had given away without thinking anyone would ever know. The same amount that had cost her a bus ride, a meal, and a morning of shame. But now it had returned surrounded by 5 black SUVs, a line of silent men, and the most feared man in the city standing inside her living room as if her dignity mattered more than his reputation. Her mother looked from the bill to Dante Moretti. "Sir," she said softly, her voice fragile but steady, "I don't know what my daughter did for you, but Grace has always had more heart than luck." Grace turned quickly. "Mama." "No," her mother whispered. "Let me say it." The room quieted. Outside, Neighbors still watched through windows and half-open doors. Harold Pike stood frozen on the porch, papers trembling in his hand, the confidence drained from him like water from a cracked cup. Grace's mother reached for her daughter's hand. When she was little, she said, looking at Dante, she used to give away her lunch at school. I'd ask why she came home hungry, and she'd say some other child looked hungrier. Grace lowered her eyes, embarrassed. Dante listened without interrupting. That alone made the moment feel strange. Powerful men usually waited only for their turn to speak. Dante Moretti listened like every word was evidence. She never had much, her mother continued. But she never let that make her small. Something in Dante's face shifted. Just slightly. Enough for Grace to notice. He turned toward the man beside him. The papers. The bodyguard handed him a second folder. Dante placed it gently on the small kitchen table, beside the medicine bottles and a chipped mug filled with old pens. Grace looked at the folder but did not touch it. What is that? She asked. A choice, Dante said. Grace's breath caught. Dante opened the folder. Inside were documents, clean and official, clipped beneath a silver fastener. The building on Hawthorne Street belongs to one of my companies. 3rd floor, 2 bedrooms, working heat, elevator, closed to your mother's clinic. He paused. It is available today. Grace took one step back. No, Dante looked at her. Her voice trembled, but she forced it to stay upright. No, sir. I can't accept a house from you. It's an apartment. That doesn't make it smaller. For the first time that morning, one of Dante's men glanced down, almost hiding a smile. Dante did not smile, but his eyes softened. I'm not giving it to you as charity. Grace shook her head. Then what is it? Dante was quiet for a moment. The radiator clicked in the corner. Her mother's breathing filled the space between them. Then he said, restitution. Grace frowned. For what? For every room you cleaned while going home to one without heat. For every insult you swallowed because you needed the paycheck. For every person who mistook your silence for permission. The words entered the room slowly. Grace felt them before she fully understood them. Dante looked toward Harold Pike, still standing at the door. And for men who build comfort by stealing it from people who cannot fight back. Harold's face flushed. I didn't steal anything. Dante turned his head. That was all. Harold went silent again. Grace looked at the apartment papers, then at her mother, then at the walls of the home she had tried so hard to keep. The cracked paint, the plastic over the windows, the couch where her mother slept because the bedroom stayed too cold. She wanted to say no. Pride rose in her chest like a shield. But then her mother coughed. A small cough. Tired. Painful. Grace closed her eyes. Dante saw the battle in her face and lowered his voice. Grace, accepting protection does not erase your strength. Her eyes opened. He held her gaze. It proved someone finally recognized it. The room went still. Slowly, Grace touched the folder. Not taking it yet. Just touching it. And somehow, that small movement made her mother cry. Outside, the neighbors whispered. Harold Pike stared at the ground. The black SUVs gleamed beneath the morning sun. Grace Carter had woken up expecting another day of survival. Instead, judgment had come to her doorstep. And for once, it had not come for her. Grace Carter did not move into the Hawthorne apartment that morning. She could not. Not because she did not need it. Not because her mother did not need heat, safety, and an elevator that would keep her from climbing stairs with aching lungs. But because Grace had spent her whole life learning that gifts from powerful people often came with invisible chains. Dante Moretti seemed to understand. He did not push the folder toward her. He did not dress his offer in sweet words. He simply closed it, placed it on the table, and said, think about it. Grace looked at him with cautious eyes. You're not angry? No, people usually are when I don't accept help right away. Dante's gaze moved over the small room, the patched curtains, the medicine bottles, the photograph of Grace as a little girl standing beside her mother in a church dress 2 sizes too big. Then they were helping themselves feel generous, he said. Not helping you. Grace had no answer for that. Outside, one of Dante's men guided Harold Pike away from the porch to speak with the attorney over the phone. Harold's voice, once sharp enough to cut through walls, had become small and obedient. Neighbors watched with the careful silence of people who had suffered under the same man and were afraid to hope too loudly. Mrs. Alvarez from next door stepped onto her porch, arms folded against the cold. Mr. Pike took my deposit too, she called softly. Then another voice rose from 2 houses down. He shut my heat off last January. Another curtain opened. Another door. One by one, the street began to speak. Grace stood frozen, listening as quiet people found their voices. Not shouting, not celebrating, just telling the truth, piece by piece, like setting down stones they had carried for too long. Dante listened to all of it. His men wrote everything down. For the first time in years, Harold Pike looked afraid of the people he had been hurting. Grace's mother wiped her eyes with the edge of her blanket. "Baby," she whispered, "sometimes God sends help wearing a face you don't expect." Grace glanced at Dante. He stood in her doorway, dark coat, sharp jaw, dangerous reputation, and a stillness that made the whole street careful. No, he was not what she expected. But when he turned back to her, his voice was low and respectful. "There is something else." Grace's shoulders tightened again. "What?" "Elias Romano wants to see you once he's stronger. He also asked me to start something I should have started years ago." Dante took a small card from his coat and placed it beside the folder. Grace read the words printed across the top. "The Romano Moretti Relief Foundation." She looked up. Dante continued, "For elderly tenants, underpaid workers, families trapped by landlords like Pike, people who fall through every crack because no one with power bothers to look down." Grace touched the edge of the card. "What does that have to do with me? I want you to help run it." Her breath disappeared. Around the room, even her mother went still. "Me?" Grace whispered. "You know what people need before they ask," Dante said. "You know what humiliation sounds like. You know the difference between charity and dignity." Grace shook her head slowly. "Sir, I clean houses." "No," Dante said. "You notice what everyone else steps over." The words struck deeper than praise. Grace looked again at the card, then at the apartment folder, then through the open door where her neighbors stood watching, their faces carrying years of swallowed complaints. She thought of the old man outside the pharmacy. She thought of $18. She thought of all the times she had been told to be grateful for scraps, while others feasted behind locked gates. Her voice came out quiet. "If I help, I decide who gets hurt." Dante held her gaze. "Yes. And no one has to beg." "No. And you don't use their pain to make yourself look kind." For the first time, Dante almost smiled. "Agreed." Grace looked at her mother. Her mother nodded once, tears shining on her cheeks. Grace picked up the card. Outside, the street remained silent. But it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of people watching dignity return through a door they thought had been locked forever. 6 months later, the house on Hawthorne Street smelled like fresh paint, warm bread, and lavender soap. Grace Carter's mother no longer slept on a couch beneath 2 blankets. She had her own room now, with sunlight in the mornings and a chair by the window where she could watch the neighborhood children walk to school. The medicine bottles were still there. Life had not become perfect, but it had become safe. And safety, Grace had learned, was one of the quietest forms of mercy. Every morning, she still woke before sunrise. Only now, she did not put on a black housekeeping uniform and walk through cold streets with hunger folded beneath her ribs. She dressed in a navy coat, pinned her hair back, and took the elevator downstairs to a waiting car that brought her to a small office on the first floor of a brick building downtown. On the glass door were gold letters, "The Romano Moretti Relief Foundation." Beneath them, smaller, Director of Community Outreach, Grace Carter. The first time she had seen that title, she had cried in the hallway where no one could see. Not because of the office, not because of the salary, but because for the first time in her life, her ability to notice suffering had been treated like a qualification instead of a weakness. People came through that door every day. Elderly women with eviction notices folded in trembling hands. Single fathers whose wages had been stolen. Young mothers choosing between medicine and rent. Janitors, waitresses, caregivers, dishwashers. People who had spent years being told to be patient while others profited from their silence. Grace never let them beg. She had one rule in her office. No one had to prove they were worthy of dignity. They only had to tell the truth. On the wall behind her desk, inside a simple black frame, was an $18 bill. Not the crisp one Dante had returned to her. The original. Elias Romano had kept it. When he recovered, he placed it in Grace's hands with tears in his eyes and said, "This bought me medicine." But it also reminded an old man that the world had not gone completely cold. Grace had not known what to say, so she framed it. Not as a trophy, as a warning. Never forget what small mercy can cost someone who has almost nothing. That afternoon, Dante Moretti stood quietly in the doorway of her office as Grace finished speaking with Mrs. Alvarez, the neighbor who had once been afraid to challenge Harold Pike. Now Mrs. Alvarez held a check returning her stolen deposit, plus damages approved by a housing court attorney Dante had hired but Grace had chosen. Mrs. Alvarez hugged Grace tightly. "God bless you, baby," she whispered. Grace smiled. "You deserved what was yours." When the woman left, Dante stepped inside. He looked different in this office. Still dangerous. Still carved from silence and expensive cloth. But softer around the eyes, as if the foundation had changed something in him too. "You've helped 43 families this month," he said. Grace closed a folder. 44, if Mr. Jennings signs his paperwork. Dante's mouth almost curved. "You keep count better than my accountants." "People aren't numbers, sir." "No," he said quietly. "They're not." For a moment, neither spoke. Through the window, the city moved as it always had, loud, impatient, shining in some places and breaking in others. But somewhere inside that movement, a few people had heat again. A few doors had stayed unlocked. A few mothers had slept without fear. Because one woman had given away her last $18. And one powerful man had finally understood what power was for. Grace looked at the framed bill. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if no one had seen me that night?" Dante followed her gaze. "Yes. What do you think?" He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I think you still would have done it." Grace smiled faintly. "And I think," Dante continued, "that is why the world needed to see." Outside, the evening light turned the glass buildings gold. Inside, Grace Carter sat behind a desk that once would have seemed impossible, listening as the next frightened person walked through the door. She rose to greet them. Not above them. Not beneath them. Beside them. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.